In the year 2005, a young geneticist stepped off a small aircraft onto a grass airstrip in the Solomon Islands, carrying nothing more than a cooler of swabs, a notebook, and a question that had bothered scientists for over a century. Walking into a village on the island of Malaita, he was met by children running toward him, laughing, barefoot, skin a deep rich brown under the equatorial sun. And there, mixed among them, were children with hair so pale and golden it looked almost dyed. It had not been. This was natural. This was ancient. Within a few years, the blood and saliva collected that day would shatter one of the oldest myths in human genetics, a myth so embedded in Western thinking that almost nobody had bothered to question it. For generations, people believed blonde hair belonged to one place only, the cold, pale lands of Northern Europe. That belief was about to collapse, and when it did, it would reveal something far stranger, far older, and far more human than anyone expected. For a very long time, the world thought it understood the story of blonde hair. The image was simple, almost a cliché. A face from somewhere in Northern Europe, pale skin, light eyes, and a head of soft golden strands that seemed to belong to the cold forests of Scandinavia, the misty coastlines of the Baltic, the windswept hills of Ireland and Scotland. That was the picture repeated endlessly in books, in films, and casual conversation. Blonde hair was European hair, Northern European hair, and for centuries almost nobody questioned it. Then DNA began telling a very different story, one that did not match that simple picture at all. Because deep in the Pacific, on remote islands thousands of miles from Europe, scientists started noticing something strange. They found children with hair as light and golden as anything you might find in Norway or Sweden. Their skin was dark, their eyes were brown, and their families had lived on those islands for tens of thousands of years. Their ancestors had never set foot anywhere near Europe, and yet there it was, natural, native, ancient blonde hair growing on heads where nobody expected to find it. For a long time, the easy explanation was sailors, outsiders, European traders, or missionaries passing through in recent centuries and leaving their genes behind. People told themselves that story because it was familiar, because it fit neatly into what they already believed about human history. But when researchers finally sequenced the DNA of those blonde-haired island children, what they discovered shook everything. Scientists thought they knew about where blonde hair really comes from. The gene producing their golden hair was not the same gene that produces blonde hair in Europe. It was a completely different mutation, a different switch in a different place in the genome, something that had evolved independently on the other side of the world in a population with no recent connection to any European ancestor. And once that one mystery cracked open, more followed. In Australia, in the heart of the outback, blonde-haired Aboriginal children ran across the red earth. In remote parts of Southeast Asia, in small isolated island communities, the same light strands kept appearing again and again. In places the old story insisted they should not exist at all. To understand why the discovery in the Pacific hit the scientific world so hard, we first need to understand what researchers already believed about blonde hair in Europe. For decades, geneticists thought they had that part of the story locked down. They had traced the European version of blonde hair to a very specific change in the human genome, a single mutation near a gene involved in pigment signaling called KIT-LG, which sits close to another gene often discussed in these studies. That mutation altered the way pigment is delivered to the hair follicle, dialing down the production of dark melanin and leaving behind the lighter tones we recognize as gold, honey, ash, and platinum. The estimated age of that European mutation is striking. Most studies place it somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 years ago, which is remarkably recent in genetic terms. It appears to have emerged in populations of hunter-gatherers somewhere near the Pontic Steppe and the Black Sea region, and then spread outward from there, moving with migrating groups across plains and forests, into Scandinavia, into the British Isles, and into pockets of Central and Eastern Europe, where it eventually became common. Researchers have proposed several theories for why this mutation spread so widely once it appeared. One points to vitamin D. At high northern latitudes, weak winter sunlight makes it harder for dark skin and hair to synthesize enough of it, so lighter pigmentation may have helped early northern populations absorb more of that scarce light. Another leans on sexual selection. The idea that blonde hair simply stood out and became preferred by partners over generations. A third, favored by some population geneticists, points to genetic drift alone, small founding populations where a rare mutation became common purely by chance. Whatever the true mixture of causes, the resulting picture in textbooks was tidy. Blonde hair in humans was treated as a European trait, with a European origin, belonging to a particular branch of humanity in a particular place at a particular point in time. That story seemed complete for a very long time. It was repeated in genetics papers, in anthropology courses, and endlessly in popular culture, almost never questioned. But the story was not complete. It had a hole in it, a hole shaped like an island chain in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Solomon Islands lie east of Papua New Guinea, scattered across the warm waters of the southwestern Pacific, remote, mountainous, covered in dense rainforest and ringed by coral reefs. The people who live there are Melanesians, with some of the darkest natural skin tones of any population on Earth. Their ancestors settled those islands tens of thousands of years ago, descended from one of the earliest waves of modern humans to leave Africa, the same expansion that eventually reached Australia and New Guinea. By every conventional rule of human pigmentation, the people of the Solomon Islands should have dark hair to match their dark skin, and most of them do. But not all of them. Travelers, missionaries, and anthropologists had been noting the same striking detail for well over a century. Walking through a Solomon Islands village, you might see a small child with deep brown skin, dark brown eyes, dark eyebrows, and a full head of pale blonde hair the color of straw, honey, or sunlit gold. The contrast was so vivid it was almost impossible to ignore. Some adults carried the trait too, though the hair often darkened with age, fading toward sandy brown by adulthood. In some communities, researchers later estimated that as many as 1 in every 10 children was born with naturally blonde hair, an astonishing frequency for a trait supposedly confined to Europe. For decades, the assumption was simple and deeply wrong. It had to be European ancestry, sailors, whalers, traders, or missionaries who passed through during the colonial era and left a few stray genes behind. This assumption did more than misunderstand the science. It quietly reassigned something that belonged to the islanders themselves and handed the credit to outsiders who had never earned it. In the early 2000s, a team of geneticists connected with Stanford University finally decided to test the assumption directly. With the full consent and cooperation of local communities, they collected hair samples and cheek swabs from villagers, both blonde and dark-haired, often from the same extended families, then compared the genomes side by side, hunting for whatever tiny difference separated the golden-haired children from their dark-haired siblings and cousins. What the team found, published in the journal Science in 2012, stunned the wider field of human genetics. The blonde hair in the Solomon Islands was not caused by the European mutation near KITLG at all, and there was no meaningful European DNA hiding inside these family lines. Genome-wide analysis showed the islanders to be overwhelmingly, almost purely Melanesian in ancestry, with no significant recent admixture from outside their own island chain. And yet they were blonde. The cause had to be something else entirely, something local, something that had evolved right there in the Pacific, on its own, completely independent of Europe. The responsible gene turned out to be TORP1, short for tyrosinase-related protein 1, long known to play a role in melanin production in skin, hair, and eyes across many species, including mice, horses, and dogs. A single amino acid substitution in TYRP1 was enough to reduce the dark pigment delivered to the hair follicles of these islanders. The outcome looked the same as the European mutation, lighter hair, but it came from a completely different gene, a completely different pathway, a completely independent evolutionary event. 2 different roads, arriving at the same destination purely by chance. That was the moment the old, tidy story broke apart for good. Blonde hair was not a single European invention that spread outward across the globe. It was a trait that had evolved at least twice in human history, in 2 entirely separate populations, on opposite sides of the planet, with no meaningful contact between them for tens of thousands of years. The Solomon Islanders had not borrowed their blonde hair from European sailors passing through in wooden ships. They had grown it themselves, out of their own genome, in their own time, on their own islands. It was native to the Pacific. It belonged to them, and it always had. The discovery sent ripples through the scientific world almost immediately. Suddenly, every old assumption about human pigmentation needed re-examination. The question researchers were asking was no longer where blonde hair came from, singular. The question became, how many times had it appeared independently across human history, and how many other populations might be quietly carrying their own separate versions of light hair, hidden in plain sight, simply waiting to be tested with modern sequencing technology. The next place researchers turned their attention was Australia. Aboriginal Australians represent one of the oldest continuous populations on Earth. Their ancestors arrived on the continent at least 50,000 years ago, and some estimates push that figure to 65,000 years or more, following one of the most remarkable ocean crossings in early human history. Over tens of millennia, they spread across the continent, adapting to deserts, tropical rainforests, coastlines, and mountain ranges, developing some of the oldest continuously practiced cultures in the world. Skin tones range from deep brown to nearly black, an adaptation well suited to the intense ultraviolet exposure of the Australian outback. Hair, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is dark, but not always. For generations, photographers, missionaries, and anthropologists traveling through the central deserts documented something striking, particularly among certain communities in the western desert region and parts of the Pilbara. Aboriginal children, sometimes in surprising numbers, were born with hair that was noticeably light, not always platinum blonde, but frequently sandy, honey-colored, or even near white gold in early childhood. Set against dark skin and dark eyes, the contrast could be dramatic. As with the Solomon Islands, the light hair often darkened with age, though in a meaningful number of individuals, it persisted well into adulthood. For most of the 20th century, the same flawed explanation took hold in Australia that had taken hold in the Pacific. It must be European admixture. It must be a legacy of colonial contact, an inheritance from settlers, station workers, or itinerant laborers. Some Aboriginal families were told this so often, so confidently by outside authorities, that the explanation became embedded in their own understanding of their family history, despite having no genetic basis whatsoever. Once again, DNA studies eventually told the truth. Researchers sequencing the genomes of blonde-haired Aboriginal Australian children found that, in the vast majority of these cases, the lighter hair could not be explained by recent European ancestry at all. The genomes were overwhelmingly deeply Aboriginal, with roots stretching back tens of thousands of years into the continent's own deep past. The blonde hair was not borrowed, it was native, and remarkably, the responsible gene in many of these individuals appeared to be the very same TYRP1 mutation identified in the Solomon Islands, the same single amino acid change, the same lightening of pigment, surfacing again in a population separated by thousands of miles of open ocean and tens of thousands of years of completely independent history. That particular finding was, in some ways, even more startling than the original Solomon Islands discovery, because it suggested the TYRP1 mutation was extremely old enough to have existed within the ancient populations of Sahel, the vast prehistoric landmass that once joined Australia and New Guinea into a single continent before rising sea levels split them apart roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago. Old enough that when the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and the ancestors of Pacific Islanders eventually separated and followed different paths across an unfamiliar world, they may have each carried a version of that same ancient mutation with them, where it persisted quietly, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden across an almost unimaginable span of generations. So blonde hair was not simply a European story and not simply a Pacific one either. It was a trait that had emerged independently in at least two, and quite possibly more, entirely separate branches of the human family, evolved thousands of miles and thousands of generations apart. The more closely researchers looked, the more places it began to appear. In parts of Vanuatu, in coastal and highland Papua New Guinea, and across smaller Melanesian communities, scientists documented the same pattern. Children with strikingly light hair, adults with sandy or golden strands well into later life, and the TYRP1 mutation, or close relatives of it, turning up again and again. The frequency varied from place to place, rare in some villages, strikingly common in others. Even outside the Pacific and Australia, researchers found intriguing hints. The Ainu people, indigenous to Japan's northern islands, particularly Hokkaido, have long been noted for features distinguishing them from the broader East Asian population, including wavy hair, more abundant body hair, and distinctive facial structure, and in some individuals, especially in childhood, noticeably lighter hair tones. The Ainu are thought to be one of the older, more genetically distinct populations of the region, having branched away from neighboring groups thousands of years ago. Researchers have also documented isolated reports of naturally lighter hair in remote highland communities across Central Asia, and scattered instances of unusual pigmentation in small pockets of Africa. In many of these cases, the underlying mutations turn out to be entirely different once again, distinct genetic pathways producing a broadly similar outcome. In every case, the lesson is the same. Human pigmentation is far more genetically complex than most textbooks even a generation ago suggested. Hair color, like skin and eye color, results from many genes interacting. The same visible outcome can be reached through many different genetic paths. Scientists call this convergent evolution, when separate, often unrelated populations, or even entirely separate species, independently evolve the same trait through different genetic routes. Wings evolved independently in bats, birds, and insects. Eyes evolved independently and repeatedly in vertebrates and in octopuses. Streamlined bodies evolved independently in fish, ichthyosaurs, and dolphins. Unrelated lineages solving the same problem in similar ways. Now blonde hair joins that list. The same visible trait evolved at least twice, and possibly more, across entirely separate branches of the human species. What this tells us about the deep history of our species is worth sitting with. For a long time, we told ourselves stories about human diversity that were too small, too neat, too eager to sort people into fixed categories. Light hair belonged to Europeans. Dark skin belonged to Africans. Particular eye shapes belonged to particular regions of Asia. The categories felt tidy and intuitive, repeated so often they came to feel like settled fact. But they were wrong, or at least far too narrow to contain the sprawling complexity of human biology. The truth genetics keeps revealing is that human variation does not sort itself neatly along the cultural lines we drew centuries ago. Traits cross borders that were never really borders in a biological sense. Mutations appear in unexpected places, and populations that look dramatically different on the surface often share far more than either group ever realized. The story of blonde hair is one of the clearest, most visually striking examples of exactly this principle. The same recognizable trait appears on a child in rural Norway, on a child in a Solomon Islands village, and on a child in the red dust heart of Central Australia. All three show the world essentially the same gold and honey-colored strands, yet each of them arrived at that trait through a completely different doorway in their own DNA, descended from ancestors who, at some point across an immense span of history, happened to be born carrying a small, specific change in a small, specific gene, a change that produced lighter hair, a change that, for whatever combination of reasons, persisted within their community and was passed down faithfully through countless generations of descendants who followed. There is something quietly powerful hidden inside that scientific fact, because it means that no single people, no single community, and no single continent holds any kind of exclusive claim over any particular human trait. The characteristics we casually associate with one part of the world have a habit of independently appearing elsewhere, arriving through entirely different biological routes, often going unnoticed or misunderstood for generations at a time. The human family, taken as a whole, is far more deeply intertwined, and at the same time far more astonishingly varied than any simple, tidy origin story could ever hope to capture. And the more deeply scientists dig into our shared genetic history, the more humility that ongoing discovery should inspire in the rest of us. There is one more dimension worth pausing on. For generation after generation, Aboriginal Australian and Solomon Islander children with naturally blonde hair were told the trait must have come from outsiders, from someone else's ancestry entirely. Those children and their families were quietly being asked to give up a small piece of themselves, to accept that something beautiful and natural about who they were did not actually belong to them. When science finally caught up with the truth, it handed that piece back. Their hair was, and had always been, entirely their own, sprung from the same deep ancestry that gave them their skin tone, their eyes, their languages, and their connection to land and culture stretching back tens of thousands of years. The discovery of TYRP1 in the Pacific was never only a scientific triumph. It was also a quiet act of correction, a reminder that something appearing foreign on the surface may, underneath, be entirely native. Today, when researchers examine the global distribution of naturally light hair among indigenous populations, they see something closer to a map of independent origins than a single point radiating outward. There is a patch in northern and eastern Europe where the KITLG-linked mutation took hold during or shortly after the last ice age and spread through the populations that became Scandinavians, Baltic peoples, Slavs, and Celts. There is a second, distant patch across the Pacific, where TYRP1 quietly persisted for tens of thousands of years in the genomes of Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians, unnoticed until modern sequencing caught up with it, and scattered around those two are smaller, still partly unexplained occurrences elsewhere, some already tied to specific mutations, others still under investigation. Together, they form a far richer picture than the old single-origin story ever told, a species evolving in parallel across distant lands, producing similar variation more than once. There is also a deeper mystery here that continues to fascinate researchers. The TYRP1 mutation found across the Pacific appears genuinely ancient, considerably older than the European KITLG mutation, with some estimates placing its origin tens of thousands of years in the past, potentially before Sahel itself split apart into modern-day Australia and New Guinea. If that holds up, it raises a startling possibility. The very first humans to carry what we would now call natural blonde hair may not have been pale-skinned Ice Age Europeans at all, but the ancient peoples of Sahel, direct ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians, living under intense tropical sun tens of thousands of years before the European mutation ever appeared. The first blonde humans on the planet, under this picture, may have lived in the tropics rather than the tundra. That possibility quietly rewrites a large portion of the popular imagination around blonde hair. The familiar image of the first blonde human as a fair-skinned Nordic figure gives way to something entirely different. A child running along a tropical shoreline, dark-skinned, brown-eyed, hair the color of ripened wheat catching the salt wind on a coastline long since vanished beneath rising seas. That child may represent the true beginning of one of the earliest threads of light hair in the human family, a thread her distant descendants still carry today on islands and continents the old European-centered story never thought to consider. Research into this question is still ongoing. Geneticists continue working through the genomes of additional indigenous populations, still searching for new pigmentation variants, still piecing together the fuller history of human hair, skin, and eye color. New mutations linked to lighter hair keep being identified as sequencing technology becomes cheaper and more accessible to researchers working directly with local communities. why certain mutations spread widely in some populations, and while staying rare in others, remains an active question, along with what role shifting climates, migration, chance, isolation, and social preference played in keeping these rare variants alive across thousands of generations. Some answers may arrive within the coming decade. Others may take considerably longer. Each new discovery in this field adds another small, careful piece to the much larger picture of who human beings actually are and where, biologically speaking, we truly came from. And every piece uncovered so far seems to point toward the same broader, humbling truth. Human beings, despite our many visible differences in outward appearance, are far more closely related to one another, genetically speaking, than our surface-level traits would ever suggest on their own. The overwhelming majority of human DNA is shared identically across every population on Earth, regardless of where on the planet a person's ancestors happen to live. The visible differences that separate us at a glance, the color of our skin, the color of our eyes, the color of our hair, are produced by a surprisingly small set of genetic switches, often nothing more than a single letter, changed at one specific point along an otherwise nearly identical genome. And in the case of blonde hair, those switches have flipped independently, in strikingly different ways, in at least two entirely separate corners of the human family. The result, taken together, is the remarkable, varied, sometimes genuinely surprising humanity we see scattered across the world today. If you happen to have blonde hair yourself, somewhere far back along your family line, one of your ancestors carried one of these rare, specific mutations forward through countless generations to eventually reach you. If your ancestry traces back primarily to Northern or Eastern Europe's, that inherited variant is almost certainly the KITLG-linked mutation that first took hold near the Black Sea region roughly 10 or 11,000 years ago, before gradually spreading northward and westward across the continent over subsequent millennia. If your ancestry instead traces back to the Pacific Islands or to Aboriginal Australia, the responsible variant may well be the TAI-RP1 mutation instead, a version of blonde hair that is genuinely ancient and genuinely native to that part of the world, considerably older than its European counterpart. And if your family's roots lie somewhere else entirely, somewhere researchers have not yet fully mapped, your blonde hair may belong to a third or even a fourth, still undiscovered thread of independent human evolution, quietly waiting for its own scientific discovery sometime in the years ahead. In every single case, the hair color you carry is never simply your own personal trait in isolation. It is the accumulated product of countless ancestors, spanning countless generations, carrying forward a mutation that managed to survive, adapt, and pass successfully from parent to child across an enormous stretch of deep time. Every blonde-haired child born today, anywhere on Earth, represents the newest link in a genetic chain stretching back tens of thousands of years, sometimes traveling along more than a single chain at once, sometimes moving quietly across more than one continent, and sometimes carried forward through more than one entirely independent mutation. In a very real sense, the full history of blonde hair mirrors the broader history of humanity itself. It stands as a quiet reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where our traits come from are almost always a few careful steps behind the actual scientific truth. We repeat familiar explanations because they feel comfortable and familiar. We pass them along to the next generation, and eventually they start to feel like obvious, settled fact. And then, occasionally, a researcher steps off a small aircraft onto a remote grass airstrip with a simple kit for collecting saliva swabs, and the entire story we thought we understood turns out to be only one small piece of a far larger, far older, and far more fascinating puzzle. That, in the end, is the true beauty of science. Not that it hands us tidy final answers wrapped up neatly forever, but that it keeps quietly opening doors we never even realized were there, continually showing us just how much more there still is left to learn about ourselves, about our ancestors, and about the astonishing interconnected history written directly into every strand of our DNA.